Welcome to chapter 4 of the book of Daniel. We're going to have there's a bit of a challenge, I should say, with this chapter and the next one as well. The how things are worded and used in the Old Testament does not match up with what we know from Babylonian history. So let's clarify a couple things as we go through this chapter. Now, this chapter is predominantly focused on Daniel interpreting the king's dream about the great tree and understanding some prophecy about the king that's going to happen in his future. In verse 1, it says, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. So we could think of this as Daniel talking to the king. Now he's mentioning Nebuchadnezzar as the person he's talking to. However, though, most likely this is not Nebuchadnezzar he's talking to. When we look at history, you see in the book of Daniel, we go from Nebuchadnezzar to Belteshazzar. The problem is Belteshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. There's a king in between them called Nabonidus. That is Nebuchadnezzar's son. Nabonidus is the one that leaves and then comes back later, and he leaves his son in charge, which is Belteshazzar. So there's a discrepancy here. The Old Testament is not matching with history in this section of the book of Daniel. So just kind of an FYI on how that works out. So let's take a second here, though, as we begin and understand Nabonidus and a little bit more about Babylonian history. And we don't know for sure if we don't know if the history is right or if these stories are actually connected to Nebuchadnezzar. We don't know 100% sure, but we think it's Nabonidus that these are connected with. Now, Nabonidus, it's an Akkadian name, means Nabu is praised. He was the last king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, reigning from 556 to 539 BC, so 17 years in reign. He seized power in a coup, toppling King Labashai Marduk. He angered the priests and commoners of Babylon by neglecting the city's chief god, Marduk, and elevating the moon god Sin to the highest status. Nabonidus left the capital for 10 years to build and restore temples, mostly to Sin, who is the sun god, leaving his son Belshazzar in charge. While leading excavations for the restoration effort, he initiated the world's first known archaeological work. Meantime, the Persian Achaemenid Empire to the east, led by Cyrus the Great, had been gaining strength, and King Cyrus had become popular among the residents of Babylon by posing as the one who would restore Marduk to his rightful place in the city. As the Persians advanced to Babylon, Nabonidus returned. He was captured by the Persians in 539 BC, and Babylon was occupied, thus ending the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Cyrus was welcomed into the city, where he performed the rites of Marduk. Nabonidus' fate is uncertain, though it is believed he was exiled to Iran and allowed to occupy a government post. Modern perceptions of Nabonidus' reign have been heavily colored by accounts written well after his reign as king of Babylon, most notably by the Persians and the Greeks. As a result, Nabonidus has often been described in very negative terms in both modern and contemporaneous scholarship. However, an accumulation of evidence and a reassessment of existing material has caused opinions on Nabonidus and the events that happened during his reign to alter significantly in recent decades. So we can see there's these discrepancies that we see through Babylonians' records that's different than what we see in Daniel. Now, if you were paying attention, you heard that Nabonidus took over the kingdom from another person named Labashai Marduk, not Nebuchadnezzar. So let's talk about him for a second here. His name means, "May I not come to shame, O Marduk." He was the fifth king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, ruling in 556 BC. He was the son and successor of Neriglissar, though classical authors such as Berosus wrote that Labashai Marduk was just a child when he became king. Babylonian documents indicate that he had been in charge of his own affairs before his rise to the throne, suggesting he was an adult. Labashai Marduk's reign was very short, lasting only 2 to 3 months, with the latest evidence of Neriglissar being alive from April 556, and documents dated to his successor Nabonidus appearing by the end of June the same year. Nabonidus led a coup against the king, deposing and killing Labashai Marduk. The reason for Nabonidus' usurpation of the throne is unknown. Berosus simply describes the justification as Labashai Marduk having indulged in evil ways. So we've just had another name, Neriglissar. So let's learn about him. Neriglissar was the fourth king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, ruling from his usurpation of the throne in 560 BC to his death in 556 BC. Though unrelated to previous Babylonian kings, possibly being of Aramean ancestry, Neriglissar was a prominent official and general in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, and became even more influential through marrying one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, possibly Kashishiya. I think that's how you say it. Nebuchadnezzar was initially succeeded by his son Amel-Marduk, but Amel-Marduk's reign only lasted for 2 years before Neriglissar usurped the Babylonian throne and put him to death. Through his marriage to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, possibly significantly older than either of the old king's sons, Neriglissar might have represented a less legitimate but more wealthy and well-established faction of the royal family, even if he himself was not part of his family. The most well-documented event of Neriglissar's reign in a successful 557 to 556 BC campaign in Anatolia against Apuwashu, king of a small kingdom in Cilicia. Neriglissar successfully captured Apuwashu's capital Ura as well as another city, Kirshu, before conducting an amphibious attack against a nearby island and then laying waste to mountain passes on the western border to Lydia. Shortly after returning home to Babylonia victorious, Neriglissar died in April 556 BC. He was succeeded as king by his son Labashai-Marduk, whose reign would only last for 2 or 3 months before being deposed and killed in favor of Nabonidus. So I mentioned at the beginning, Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. That actually might be incorrect. That's sometimes commonly seen as a tradition, but maybe that one's actually incorrect too after reading through this more. It's been a while since I put these notes in here. A lot of this comes from Wikipedia, this understanding of these kings. You can look up Babylonian kings and read this. So from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar, there are several kings that are in there, according to what we learn in Wikipedia. So realize that when we see this in Daniel chapter 4, it's hard to say this is Nebuchadnezzar because there were several other kings in this time. Remember, Daniel was in Babylon for 70 years. Most of these kings didn't last more than a few some odd years at a time. Nabonidus was around 17 years. So all within the time frame that Daniel could have been in Babylon. So again, the Old Testament isn't matching up with what we know from the records of Babylon themselves. So just so you understand, okay, when it says here in chapters like chapter 4 and 5, we're not 100% sure which king this is referring to. It could be Nebuchadnezzar. Most likely it's more like Nabonidus, honestly, is who they're referring to. But there's some discrepancies in there. So I just kind of wanted to get you up to speed with that as you're looking through this. So let's move on with this. So this is still, we're hearing this as if Daniel is like talking to the king. So verse 2, I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Now, again, this sounds like, verses 1, 2, and 3 sound like someone talking to the king. Verse 4 is Nebuchadnezzar speaking, or whoever this king is, speaking to Daniel. So verse 4 we get, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. So now we're getting into a discussion of this dream the king had. There's probably missing information in this chapter as to why was Daniel and the king talking to each other at this time. It almost, if you take this in a more literal stance, it sounds like Daniel is approaching the king saying, hey, king, I want to talk about the kingdom of God for a second here. And he mentions that how great, it's a great kingdom, it's wonderful, it's awesome. And then suddenly the king talks to him. So we don't know. We don't know for sure. Could the first 3 verses be a pretext? Maybe a scribe put in? Maybe. Maybe there's more in between verses 3 and 4 that we don't have. There's some possibilities of what could be there. But anyways, let's get into this dream that the king is having. So he says in verse 6, therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. Then came in the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers, and I took the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But at the last, Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Before him I told the dream, saying. So let's pause for a second here. Verse 8 gives us some interesting clues. So he's not talking to Daniel. He's talking to someone about this dream, is what we're getting. So maybe we don't quite know who is the narrator in this chapter. We assume it'd be Daniel because it's in the book of Daniel. But why would the king be talking about Daniel and his experience with Daniel to Daniel? You see, so these are some of the things that scholars look at and try to understand what's really going on here. We maybe don't know who is the writer of chapter 4 in the book of Daniel, because we'd assume it'd be Daniel. But again, why would Daniel write down, hey, the king talked with me about this thing that we did together? It doesn't make sense. Why would they do that? So just from a scholarly standpoint, when we look at this chapter, there's a few things we're not sure about on this chapter. But let's look into this dream. So now after verse 8, this is the dream of the king that he's now explaining to Daniel. And this is one of the first places we get in the book of Daniel where they use Daniel's Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. Because remember, they've used Daniel most of the time since he's gotten it. They told us at the beginning he got it. This is one of the first times they've used it, because they've usually used Daniel's name, because Daniel, I-E-L, is more about the Hebrew God, whereas Belteshazzar is more about Babylonian gods. So, okay, verse 9, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and no secret troubleth thee. Tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen and the interpretation thereof. Now, this is interesting. Okay, a couple things here. Kyle and Delich had an interesting commentary on this. The heathens believed that the revelation of supernatural secrets belonged to the gods, and that the man who had this power must possess the spirit of the gods. And that's what he says in verse 9. I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. So that's the same idea. He doesn't think Daniel is some amazing person, but he realizes the spirit of the gods resides in Daniel, is what he's looking at. Now, even though the king is acknowledging that Daniel can prophesy things of God, it does not mean it is. This is something that's interesting, okay? Because the king knows Daniel has the spirit of God, of the gods, with him, but the king's not converting to Judaism. That's just to realize that, just because he believes that, and this comes from more idea probably of a polytheistic style of, we worship the gods that help us out. Oh, well, your God apparently is really good at a dream interpretation, so I'm going to use your God to help out. But it doesn't mean in the context of the king, he's polytheistic, meaning he believes in lots of different gods. So there's nothing for him to convert to. He doesn't need to convert. He just believes in whatever gods are going to help him. So verse 10, thus were the visions of mine head in my bed. So now this is again the king speaking still. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height thereof was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all the flesh was fed of it. I saw in the visions of my head upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, hew down the tree, cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit, lest the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. So that's the dream. That's what the king saw. So in verse 18, he says, "This dream I, King," says Nebuchadnezzar, we're not quite sure, "have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, but thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee." Remember, Daniel's done this before. He correctly told the king his dream and then interpreted it. The dream about the idol, the statue, made of different types of metal and things, the stone coming out, cut without hands, and demolishing it. That was a couple chapters ago. So this is another dream. All right, verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. The king spake and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee. So Daniel's got a problem here. He's trying to help the king out, but he's worried about this. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. So this is why Daniel is hesitant, because he doesn't want to he's worried about being the messenger, the bearer of bad news to the king. So this is not a happy dream for the king, basically. So he's like, well, so king's like, Daniel, it's okay. What is the interpretation? I'm okay, I can take it. I can handle it. He goes, well, this dream is actually really good for your enemies, not for you. So I'm a little worried to tell you about it. That's what's going on here. Now, interesting, the word astonished is an archaic word that means bewildered or filled with consternation or dismay. So if you remember, it says that Daniel was astonished for 1 hour, right at the beginning of the verse. Daniel was troubled because he knew that the message of Nebuchadnezzar's dream was not good. He knew he must announce to Nebuchadnezzar the judgments of God to come upon him. Nebuchadnezzar noticed Daniel's concern and realized that Daniel had the interpretation. He asked him with friendly address to tell him it without reserve. Daniel then communicates it in words of affectionate interest for the welfare of the king. The words, let the dream be to thine enemies, do not mean it is a dream, a prophecy such as the enemies of the king might ungraciously wish, but may the dream with its interpretation be to thine enemies, may it be fulfilled to them or refer to them. So Daniel's trying to say, yeah, this isn't a good dream for you, but hopefully this turns into bad for your enemies. So we're going to try to think about this in a better light. How can we explain this in a way that doesn't get the king really mad? So let's get into this interpretation. Verse 20, the tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached unto heaven, and the sight thereof to all the earth, whose leaves were fair, the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwell, and upon those whose branches the fowls of heaven had their habitation. It is thou, O king, that art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth. So the tree represents the king and what he has accomplished and done. Verse 23, whereas the king saw a watcher and an holy one coming down from heaven, and saying, hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which is come upon my lord the king. So verse 25 is this interpretation, that they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee. After that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. So basically, the gods are going to make you leave your kingdom and go live like an animal for a while. So the king's going to go crazy. The king's going to go crazy. Basically what it is. So verse 27, he says, "Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility." Now, here's the thing that's interesting about verse 27. He's saying basically, if the king changes his ways, if the king repents, this doesn't necessarily have to happen to him. He doesn't have to go through this. So think about this. This is kind of that idea of if it be so, but if not, kind of a phraseology. That's, you've got a choice here, king, basically. So showing mercy to the poor is a good sign of repentance or willingness to put your own thoughts aside and help others. Sin usually comes from selfish thoughts. So think about what he has here in verse 27. He says, break off thy sins by righteousness. So stop doing bad things by changing and doing good things. And thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. So if you're showing mercy to the poor, you have a changed heart. You're not prideful and selfish and those kinds of things. If you're showing mercy to the poor, there's an attitude. You have to have a certain kind of attitude to be nice to the poor, and same as the attitude of being rude to the poor. So realize how you do something is how you do everything. And there's principles that manifest in your behaviors and thoughts, basically. So he's saying if you repent and you learn to take care of the poor and use your wealth and what you have to bless the lives of others rather than enrich yourself, it's going to go better for you, basically. This doesn't have to happen to you, basically. Now, verse 28, all this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. He was probably like, oh man, crap, this is not good. Verse 29, at the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the king of Babylon. The king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? So this is a year later, basically. While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. So he had 12 months and he didn't repent. Now, another way we could say the kingdom is departed from thee is using the word timber. If you remember the metaphor, the dream was a tree and it got cut down. That's what verse 31 is the timber, declaring timber, it's coming down. Verse 32, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee to eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen. And his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. So you think of this idea, he is living as if he's an animal. He's gone crazy, and he is left. He is not getting out of the rain. He's out eating the grass like the animals are. His hair is growing out, getting really bushy and fluffy. Even his fingernails are growing out like their claws. He's not getting them clipped. He doesn't have hygiene. He's acting like an animal. He's gone crazy. Now, verse 34, and at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and mine understanding returned unto me. So he regained his sanity now. Suddenly he's like, oh my gosh. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. So Daniel was proven right, basically. The king's like, oh my gosh, what Daniel said was right. The gods have done this to me. His gods, the gods that he follows, are the true gods. Holy cow. Now, interesting here, Jared Halverson had an interesting thought about this in his Unshaken podcast. I thought was good. Some might say pride is insanity, and truth is sanity. So something to think about when you look at wickedness and pride is insanity, and truth is sanity. So being sane is following truth. Avoiding truth is insanity. It's an interesting perspective of this story, basically. Now, interesting in here too, when he praises God, he is acknowledging that the God Daniel worships is mighty in his power. This again doesn't mean he wants to convert to Judaism because he is polytheistic. So he doesn't, his idea is there are different gods for different locations, different situations, different things, basically. So it's not against his concept of religion to say your God is a great God. There's lots of gods that are great gods, and Daniel's apparently is the God of gods in a way. He's got some serious clout here. Verse 35, and all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? So this is, again, talking about God. At the same time, my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom, mine honor and brightness returned unto me, and my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways are judgment, and those that walk in pride, he is able to abase. So a big aha for the king in chapter 4. Not a lot of major stuff, but some cool metaphors and ideas that we can think about for our day and age. So let's jump over to the next chapter as we continue the book of Daniel.